Today we're talking about polymers, and polymers are something that you're really familiar with, even if you're not really familiar with the name. We're going to see how these things are going to be used in both the, say, the natural world, biological systems, but also can also be called artificial. And we're going to spend a little bit more time with the man-made ones, the artificial ones, and we're actually going to have a more familiar name for them most of the time, or part of the time, but we're going to quickly get familiar with and use polymers. So what is a polymer? Well, a polymer really simply is a long chain of repeating units, and I've got an example here that you don't need to write down, but just kind of have a look at it. You can see how it's long, although it could be an awful lot longer, but this seems to be a repetitive pattern at work. So what's a repeating unit? Well, the repeating unit is the thing that repeats, but is also is going to come from something called a monomer. So if I have that original polymer, then the repeating unit is just that piece that gets sort of copied and pasted down the line. If I have a different polymer, the repeating unit is going to be a little different. You'll notice the bottom one is quite a bit longer, but where it comes out on the right side of that, it starts to repeat what started on the left side of that repeated unit, the part in brackets. And then a monomer, the other term that I used, is the starting material, and I should actually have that as a possible plural as well, because some polymers are made up of one monomer over and over and over, and other polymers are made up of two or more monomers. And so in some cases the repeating unit can be quite long, in some cases the repeating unit is really quite simple. So to look at some natural polymers that you're already probably familiar with, we have these. So there's amino acids make up proteins. Proteins we know to be found in things like silk or hair or fingernails or muscle tissue, anything that's made of proteins. Simple sugars like glucose can be linked together in a long chain of complex carbohydrate, commonly being things like starch or plant fiber, which is mostly cellulose. And if you took biology, you're familiar with those. If you did not take biology, then you've probably heard of starch. And then DNA. Now DNA is the polymer. The repeating units are called nucleic acids, but I didn't really want to write that in. So those are some of the naturally occurring polymers, and there's a few others, although honestly most of the natural polymers are oftentimes made up of they're either proteins or they're carbohydrates or something like that. There's a few alternate ones, but we'll talk about those another time. Okay, so how do I get from a monomer to a polymer? Well, I've got this monomer here. And what happens is that monomer, if I have a lot of them, and I've only drawn one, but understand that that represents thousands and so on of them, I end up putting them together in a long chain. If I have a different kind of polymer that has, in this case, two monomers, they're going to join together and form the repeating unit that they form. Now we're going to take a closer look at how that happens in a few minutes. Okay, pretty much starting now. There's two basic types of polymerization processes, two different types of getting from the monomer to the polymer. So the first kind is called addition polymer. And what's important about that is we have to start out with a multiple bond, carbon-carbon double bond, sometimes a carbon-carbon triple bond, although most of our time it's going to be carbon-carbon double bonds. And then the electrons in that double bond are the ones that get used. So I'm going to break a bond and I'm going to form a bond. So I'm going to go through it with this one, and it's going to take me a couple of steps. But if I take that one and I break the double bond, so I take the electrons in the double bond and I move them to the other side of the carbon. They're not actually moving that far. It's just that instead of being on those carbons between the carbons, side to side, they're moving to the opposite side of each carbon. So now I've got electrons sitting out there waiting to form some other bond. If I take a bunch of those molecules, all with the double bonds, and I do the same thing, I have those electrons move to the opposite sides, then what's going to happen is where I have the electron from a carbon on one molecule facing the carbon of a different molecule, I can connect those dots. So in other words, the electrons now overlap and form new single bonds. Now the carbon-carbon bond that I've done in yellow would eventually look exactly like the carbon-carbon bond that's in whatever color that is, so it's not a different kind of bond. I've just tried to emphasize where the new bonds are being formed. The other type is what's called a condensation polymer. Now if you took biology, you've learned about condensation polymerization already. You didn't call it that, you probably called it condensation, but that was how proteins form, when amino acids form proteins, that's how when nucleotides form nucleic acids like DNA, then that's the kind of reaction that's going on. When simple sugars form complex sugars, it's a condensation reaction that's happening. Now, in polymerization in general, don't always have to lose water. It can be some other small molecule, but for our purposes, we'll use water because it's nice and simple. So I take several different monomers, and I've drawn two different monomers. They don't have to be two different ones. I could have multiples of the same one, as long as I have the ability to form water. So water is two hydrogens, one oxygen. So you'll notice I've drawn boxes around both hydrogens and one of the oxygens where they meet up. And then where I want to lose water, of course, bonds are going to have to be broken. And where bonds are broken, new bonds are formed. So again, I've done it in yellow, orange, whatever color that is. It doesn't have to always be the hydrogen from that particular one. In this case, it's the alcohol, and the OH from the carboxylic acid. It doesn't have to be that. It's just I have to remove water. So the hydrogen from one, the OH from the other. Now I have two hydrogens, one oxygen. I have water, but I've also got broken bonds. Where bonds are broken, new bonds have to be formed. Now, polymers have a variety of different properties. And if I tell you now that the other familiar word we have for polymers is plastics, and if you start thinking about all the different places we find plastics, we can have soft, stretchy plastics, we can have soft, not stretchy plastics, we can have very rigid plastics, they can be very structural. If you think about all the places we find plastics and all the different ways we use them, then we have a huge variety of properties. So how do we get those properties? Well, one thing is you can change the monomer that you start with. So if I have a nonpolar molecule like these, it's going to form a fairly nonpolar polymer. If I have a more polar monomer, then I'm going to form more polar type polymers. I want you to be very clear though, a lot of times a polar molecule might have some water solubility. Polar polymers don't necessarily. There are a couple that are water soluble. We'll talk about those another time. But how they interact with water is going to be a thing. And it could also be influence their melting points and things like that. Just how other polar molecules have properties with respect to not only solubility, but also melting points. We can also take the chain and we can make it longer. We can take a chain and put some branching on it. So for any of these things, short chain, long chain, branches, not so many branches, if I start doing things like that, I'm going to change the structure of the polymer, but I'm also going to change the properties. So I can even use, in this case, I've used the same monomer. All I've done is I've changed some branching patterns onto it. Those two actually would represent two fairly common polymers, which we'll throw some names at when we get to class. I can also, I've used the word process, but I can also change how I align the chain. So it's not a great picture, I suppose, but on the one on the far side, what I have is the polymer chains are all kind of jumbled up. Think about a big plate of spaghetti that's been cooked. The polymer chains are fairly jumbled up. And that's going to have different properties than if I were to take exactly the same chains and line them up more or less in a linear fashion. So for example, keep the spaghetti going, if I have uncooked spaghetti, fairly rigid and all in a nice line, but once I cook them they're all jumbled up, that's going to change how they interact with each other. That's going to change the properties of the overall thing. I can also add things to them, and typical things that we add are called plasticizers. Now, certain additives are just going to change the color, but other ones are going to act as molecular lubricants. So, for example, if I look at the top chain, those chains are kind of stacked in with each other, and they can't really move around very much. Whereas on the bottom one, what I have these plasticizers that act as spacers for one thing, but they also allow the chains to move around a little bit. So then I can go from something rigid, like say a credit card or a bank card, but I can take exactly the same molecule and make it more pliable and soft, like a raincoat. And I can make those two items out of exactly the same polymer, just depending on the addition of certain plasticizers. So we're going to take a look at some examples of these in class, and then we'll take a look at how do I draw the monomers, how do I recognize the repeating unit, although recognizing the repeating unit is about the simplest thing we're going to do. And then some of these other things. Being able to identify, was this likely to have been a condensation or an addition polymer? We'll get some practice at that in class. But until then, hopefully this gives us a pretty good introduction to polymers, and we'll explore them a little bit more in class. See you then.